In the glittering chandelier-lit halls of Windsor, a hushed insult uttered behind white gloves and silver trays ignited a storm that would shake the royal household. It wasn't supposed to be heard, but Princess Anne heard it. And once she did, the game changed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded inside that hall was more than a careless whisper. It was a moment that sliced through the polished calm of the monarchy, exposing the raw tensions that simmered beneath years of formality and unspoken hierarchy. The evening had begun with its usual grandiosity, the kind that foreign dignitaries remembered for a lifetime, silver gleaming, conversation sparkling, every detail choreographed to perfection. Yet beneath that sheen, the air carried a tension that only those familiar with royal politics could sense, an invisible current hinting that something was about to shift. Catherine's entrance, serene and poised, was meant to command admiration, not scrutiny. She moved with the grace expected of a future queen, but even grace cannot silence the quiet murmurs of those who feel threatened by change. The whisper came from a senior staff member, one who had served long enough to believe their years of tenure granted them the freedom to judge silently. Except last night, their judgment wasn't silent enough. A muttered remark about Catherine's lineage, soft, clipped, and laced with the kind of disdain that grows slowly over time, slipped through the air. It was the kind of comment meant to belittle, to reduce her presence to something undeserved in the eyes of those who clung to old sensibilities. Catherine didn't hear it, but Princess Anne did. Anne's reaction wasn't dramatic, nor was it performative. It didn't need to be. She simply turned her head, her eyes locking onto the offender with a precision that froze the moment in place. There was no raised eyebrow or cutting retort. Just a single, razor-sharp glance that delivered a message anyone familiar with her reputation would understand instantly. Anne was the keeper of the old code, the protector of dignity, tradition, and above all, respect. And in that moment, the code had been violated. The offender knew it, too. Their posture stiffened, their expression faltering for a split second, revealing a flicker of fear they could not hide. For as much as the monarchy projects elegance, it also demands loyalty, and Anne had always been its most unwavering sentinel. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was suffocating. Anne held her composure, outwardly still. But within her the breach echoed like a warning bell. She had seen disrespect before, had overlooked subtle slights and whispered critiques, but this one carried an edge she could not ignore. It wasn't merely rude, it was corrosive. It threatened the unity of the institution she had spent her entire life protecting. Yet she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Those who knew her could sense it, the fury coiling beneath her calm exterior, waiting, calculating, preparing for the moment she would decide what must be done. And deep down, even the staff who hadn't heard the whisper felt a chill in the room, sensing that an invisible line had been crossed. Something irreversible had begun. And while the music played on and laughter resumed around them, the true story of the night had already taken root. A decision had been made in silence, a reckoning already forming beyond the reach of polite conversation, because Anne was not the type of woman to let such an offence fade into the velvet-draped shadows of the palace. But what began as a whisper would erupt into a reckoning, and Anne's response wouldn't wait until morning. She doesn't wear a crown, but make no mistake, Princess Anne rules with steel behind the pearls. When loyalty wavers, she doesn't lecture, she eliminates. And last night, someone crossed her red line. For decades, Anne has served not just as a working royal, but as the monarchy's unyielding backbone, a woman forged in duty, discipline, and quiet authority. Her presence in royal circles isn't decorative, it's strategic. She sees what others don't. She acts when others hesitate. And for those who've dared to test her resolve, the consequences have never been gentle. Within the internal machinery of the firm, Anne's reputation is undisputed. She's the monarchy's silent regulator, the one who upholds the ancient protocols with a grip so tight, not even a whisper can slip past it unchallenged. So when that whisper last night did, it wasn't just disrespectful, it was dangerous. And Anne, as always, was ready. Her allegiance to the crown has never been in question, but what many fail to understand is how fiercely protective she has become of Catherine. Not in the way of soft affection, but in the way soldiers protect their own, because Anne knows more than anyone what it means to be judged, cornered, and doubted while smiling through the storm. Behind closed doors, there have been moments rare, private, deeply personal, when Anne stepped in to guide Catherine through the labyrinth of royal scrutiny. When the press painted her as too common, too cautious, Anne was the one who reminded her that strength in silence often speaks louder than any rebuttal. When advisors debated protocol around Catherine's future role, it was Anne's voice that cut through the noise. She didn't have to shout. She didn't even have to explain. Her silence carried more weight than anyone else's approval. The staff knew this. They knew where the line was. And yet, one crossed it anyway. What followed wasn't rage. It was something far more terrifying. It was precision. During the dessert course, with conversations swirling and cameras flashing, Anne did something unthinkable. She rose. She didn't excuse herself. She didn't look back. She simply stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor, and exited the hall. In royal etiquette, such a move is unheard of. Royals don't abandon ceremonies, not without reason. But Anne was never one for empty formalities when integrity was at stake. The meaning was clear to anyone paying attention. A decision had already been made. This wasn't an impulsive reaction. This was execution. Cold, fast, final. Even before she reached the hallway, palace insiders knew something was about to change. The murmurings began not out of curiosity but fear. For the staff member who whispered the slight, the evening had just turned from elegant routine to career-ending catastrophe. And for Anne, this was just the beginning. She didn't need approval. She didn't consult. She simply moved, and everyone else would catch up later. Because when Anne removes someone, it's not for drama, it's for survival. But what kind of offense could provoke Anne to act so swiftly, and so publicly? For that, we must rewind to the root of the resentment. Behind the curtsies and uniforms lies a fractured world: jealousies, whispered judgments, and centuries of class-based privilege. And at its center, a growing resentment toward the commoner turned future queen. To the public, the palace operates as one seamless organism, a fortress of dignity and unity. But inside, it's a battlefield carved by invisible lines. Staff halls echo with more than footsteps. They echo with legacy, with pride, with resistance to change. And Catherine, though she walks with grace, has walked straight into that resistance from the day she arrived. Her roots, though respected by the people, are viewed by some inside the royal corridors as a blemish on a bloodline that has always guarded its purity like treasure. That resentment didn't erupt overnight. It fermented, quietly, over years, in small interactions that built a culture of subtle sabotage, too sly to punish, too frequent to ignore. Inside the inner workings of palace staff culture, there exists a sharp divide. On one side, the old guard loyalists clinging to the code of generations, those who served monarchs before Catherine was even born. They see her as a polished outsider, a symbol of modern branding rather than royal breeding. On the other side, the progressive hires those who believe in evolution, in public engagement, in breaking the mold. It's here, between these two ideologies, that Catherine stands neither fully embraced nor entirely protected. Staffers don't shout their opinions. They don't need to. They communicate through tone, timing, and treatment. Eye rolls just out of sight, delayed responses to requests, names left out of casual praises, and when they think no one's watching, private jokes told in corridors, always one step away from outright insubordination. Anne, ever vigilant, had noticed this pattern long before last night. Her instincts had warned her that something dark was brewing beneath the polished professionalism. But like any soldier of the monarchy, she waited. She watched. She gathered the truth not from words, but from rhythms who spoke first, who stayed silent, who showed respect when the cameras weren't rolling. Last night's whisper wasn't new. It was the final echo of a long campaign, and Anne knew it. That's why she acted. not just in anger, but in accumulation. This wasn't a singular offence. It was the boiling point of a quiet war being waged behind the Queen's china and beneath centuries of tradition. Catherine bore the brunt of it, with a smile for years. But the toll was there in tightened jaws during engagements, in the way she would double-check her attire even when flawless, in the subtle way her confidence would dip around certain staff. She didn't say it aloud, but Anne saw it. The exhaustion, the quiet pain, the self-doubt planted not by the press, but by those meant to serve. That's what Anne couldn't forgive. That her own household, the one sworn to uphold and protect the dignity of the royal family, had become a theatre of mockery aimed at the woman who represented its future. The insult whispered last night wasn't just inappropriate, it was insidious, because it echoed everything Catherine had endured and everything Anne had sworn to stop. But to truly understand Anne's fierce response, we must explore their unexpected bond, one forged not by title, but shared scars. They're not sisters by blood, but by burden. One, born into duty. The other, married into it. What unites them is more powerful than gossip, its survival under the harshest spotlight on earth. From the beginning, their relationship wasn't warm. Princess Anne, known for her unflinching reserve and high standards, had little time for surface-level charm or delicate pleasantries. When Catherine first entered the fold, Anne watched her with guarded eyes. She had seen others come and falter. To Anne, titles meant nothing without grit. And she didn't expect grit from Catherine. Not at first. But time has a way of revealing truth, especially within palace walls. As Catherine endured her early years, under intense scrutiny, silent judgment, and suffocating expectations, Anne saw something in her shift. Not weakness, but quiet strength. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the frost began to thaw. Behind closed doors, away from the flashbulbs and protocol, Anne offered something rare protection. Not in the form of grand gestures or vocal defense, but in whispers of guidance that only a seasoned royal could offer. She'd been there. She knew the sting of tabloid slander, the frustration of being overlooked, the weight of being expected to never falter. Anne spoke plainly. She didn't flatter, but her words were steel. She once told Catherine, in a tone as firm as it was prophetic, "They'll never say it to your face, but they'll say it when they think you're not listening." It wasn't just advice, it was a warning. And Catherine, to her credit, listened. She learned, she hardened, but she never lost her grace. The evolution was undeniable. From the girl who married into the firm to the woman now seen as its most polished representative, Catherine's transformation was not accidental. It was earned. Through storms of criticism, endless comparisons, and internal tests that no one outside the palace would ever see, she stood tall, but she didn't do it alone. Anne didn't seek credit. She didn't need to. The satisfaction was in seeing someone rise on merit, not favour. And for Anne, Catherine's growing presence wasn't a threat to the institution. It was proof that tradition could survive evolution, that strength could wear a smile, that dignity didn't need to be inherited, it could be chosen. So when that insult was whispered last night, it wasn't just an attack on Catherine. It was an attack on everything Anne had spent years reinforcing. It undermined her own judgment, her silent investment, her belief that the monarchy could embrace someone who wasn't born into it, but was forged by it. The comment may have been directed at Catherine, but the blow landed squarely on Anne's values. And that made it personal. Unforgivable. Final. So, when the line was crossed, Anne didn't hesitate. What followed was a royal act of surgical precision. There were no raised voices, no press statements, just one cold phone call from a palace line. And by sunrise, one staff member's ID no longer worked. That's how Princess Anne handles betrayal. The walk back to her private quarters was as quiet as her departure. No fanfare, no visible emotion. But those who crossed paths with her felt it, the shift, the finality in her silence. She didn't slam doors or summon guards. She simply removed her gloves, sat at her desk, and picked up the receiver. The call wasn't long. It didn't need to be. She gave a name, a title, and an order. Effective immediately. No room for defense, no protocol for second chances. The decision had been made hours earlier, in the flicker of a glance. This was just the execution. Within the palace, there exists an unspoken hierarchy, not just of royals and staff, but of influence. And Anne, despite being far from the throne, commands a weight heavier than most. That night, her authority didn't require a committee. She bypassed bureaucracy, reaching directly into the machinery of internal HR with surgical clarity. The staffer in question, once considered part of the Queen's trusted service, was told before dawn they were being reassigned. But in the language of the palace, reassignment is exile with a velvet glove. The message was unmistakable. No matter how long you've served, one moment of disgrace is enough to erase you. The crown doesn't forget disloyalty, and neither does Anne. What followed was swift. Before the first pot of tea had been brewed in the staff kitchens, though dismissed employee had already been escorted out through a side exit, no farewell, no warning. Speculation spread fast. Hall whispers turned into full-blown fear. No official statement was released. There never is. But those watching the security feeds noted the unmistakable image. A lone figure leaving the premises in silence, face pale, expression unreadable. The same hands that once prepared the royal dining table now clutched a cardboard box, as if it were both shield and punishment. Symbolism was everything. This wasn't just the removal of a staff member, it was a bloodless purge carried out by the Queen's daughter, a move that reminded every soul inside those walls exactly who they were serving. Anne hadn't just acted for Catherine, she had acted for the monarchy itself. To some, it felt merciless. To others, righteous. But to everyone, it was unforgettable. By mid-morning, morale across departments was shaken. No one said Anne's name aloud, but her presence hung in the air like a warning. Boundaries had been redrawn, and those who once believed their years of service made them untouchable were now walking on glass. But while one was removed, whispers remained. And soon, the scandal would leak beyond the palace walls. It wasn't supposed to reach the tabloids. But by morning, a perfectly timed exclusive hit the royal gossip pages, anonymous source, veiled language, and just enough truth to spark wildfire. The headline was subtle but sharp. Royal tensions at dinner, princess steps in. To the untrained eye, it looked like another speculative filler piece. But for those who knew where to look, it was a coded detonation. The leak wasn't an accident. It was a message. And the timing, mere hours after the dismissal, made it clear someone inside the palace wasn't just talking, they were retaliating. All signs pointed to a junior staffer, possibly a friend of the one removed, someone still bitter and emboldened enough to stir chaos. They didn't give names. They didn't need to. The pieces were already in motion. As the press latched onto the headline, the speculation reached a fever pitch. Was this about Meghan? Was there a hidden rift between Anne and Catherine? Was this about succession? Or worse, was Catherine being silently undermined as queen in waiting? Each question only bred more. By noon, royal watchers and tabloid shows across 3 continents were dissecting every known angle. Hashtags exploded. Number Team Anne trended next to Number Royal Purge and Number Windsor Whispers. The public, hungry for any sign of fracture within the monarchy, devoured every theory like gospel. Some painted Anne as the icy enforcer, others as the secret protector. But one thing united them all. No one could ignore her anymore. Clips from the state dinner, which had been barely noticed the night before, were now playing in slow motion across social feeds. Observers analysed Catherine's posture, the tightness of her smile, the stiffness in Anne's shoulders. "Did you see that glance?" one commentator asked. That wasn't decorum. That was strategy. Frame by frame, dinner became drama. Formalities turned into foreshadowing, and the silence from Buckingham only made the noise louder. The palace offered no denial, no clarification, no statement, which, in royal terms, spoke volumes. That refusal to respond was not a shield, it was gasoline on the fire. Inside the palace, tensions began to curdle into paranoia. If a leak had already surfaced, what else might follow? Who else was talking? Alliances, once comfortably veiled behind tradition and shared duty, now began to fray. Eyes narrowed in corridors. Conversations ended when certain doors opened. The staff had been reminded of Anne's reach, but now they were also reminded of something more volatile: public opinion. And in this monarchy, perception has always been as powerful as blood. As headlines spread and alliances are tested, one question begins to swirl within the palace gates. Was this truly about one insult or a warning shot for a much deeper war? This wasn't a moment, it was a message. Princess Anne's purge sent shockwaves through the royal household, revealing a kingdom quietly splitting between traditionalists and modernists. What the world saw as a one-off disciplinary act was, in truth, a calculated warning from within. Beneath the ornate ceremonies and official smiles, the firm was fracturing. And for those who understood the deeper mechanics of royal power, it became clear. This was the first open move in a silent war. Inside those hallowed corridors, loyalties were being redrawn. On one side stood Anne and Catherine, one the enforcer of tradition, the other its evolved successor. And on the other, an old guard resistance made up of legacy staffers, whispering advisors, and figures who saw change not as progress, but as betrayal. The monarchy's internal fault lines had been widening for months. King Charles's image was growing increasingly fragile, strained by age, public skepticism, and the ever-lingering spectre of scandals past. William's rise, once smooth, now came with pressure to accelerate, and Catherine's growing influence was unsettling the foundation. No longer just a supportive consort, she had become a public pillar, graceful, composed, and, crucially, beloved. That posed a problem for those who thrived in shadows, who held power through familiarity, not merit. The dismissal of the staffer wasn't merely a reaction, it was a symbol, a break in the illusion that the monarchy always handled things quietly. It screamed that Anne was prepared to expose the cracks others tried to gloss over. Inside, subtle defiance began to emerge, not loud, not stupid, but strategic. Files delayed, meetings rescheduled, cold shoulders during ceremonial preparations. Tiny acts of resistance from those too cautious to challenge openly, but too embittered to fall in line. Leaks began to flow faster, hints to friendly journalists, half-truths dressed as off-the-record tips. The palace's control over its own narrative started to erode, and as the public speculated, some inside began to fear. Would more heads roll? Would Anne strike again? Anne, however, didn't blink. She was no longer just defending Catherine. She was defending the monarchy's future from rot within. Her allies, those few who shared her unshakable loyalty, closed ranks. These weren't just personal assistants or senior courtiers. They were veterans of crisis, loyal to the code Anne had always lived by. Protect the institution, even if it means burning parts of it down. And in hushed conversations behind guarded doors, one thing became chillingly clear: Anne wasn't finished. This was the first move, not the last. But while Anne defends the crown from within, another challenge brews outside public opinion, and Catherine is about to become its unexpected queen. They whispered that she didn't belong. She'd never measure up. But Catherine has done more than survive, she has transformed. And now, in the aftermath of Anne's fury, the nation is watching her with new eyes. What began as a hushed insult behind palace walls has rippled across a nation hungry for poise in chaos. And in Catherine, the public sees more than a duchess, they see a symbol of grace under pressure, of royalty earned rather than inherited. While headlines speculated and the court spun in confusion, she did not flinch. She didn't issue statements. She didn't retaliate. Instead, the very next morning, she appeared at a children's hospice event, composed, compassionate, and most notably untouched by scandal. The timing wasn't accidental. It was calculated, not as revenge, but as reminder. She does not need to speak to be seen. The contrast could not have been sharper. While palace insiders whispered and scrambled, while alliances fractured and loyalties crumbled, Catherine stepped into the spotlight, without a shadow on her. The same staffers who once exchanged glances now stood in silence, watching a woman who had become untouchable not by privilege, but by public will. It was more than a photo opportunity. It was a statement of calm leadership in the middle of a silent war. As talk shows erupted and digital forums dissected every angle of the staffer incident, one truth began to take shape. Catherine wasn't a passive figurehead. She was the monarchy's quiet center of gravity. The public's response was swift and decisive. On Twitter, hashtags flipped from scandal to support. On talk radio, callers praised her restraint. On morning television, commentators speculated not if, but when she would become queen. The media, once critical, now rallied. Words like dignified, resilient, and future of the monarchy flooded the headlines. Even her silence was interpreted as strength. She hadn't said a word, yet it felt as if she had won a battle none of us had even seen. For the first time in years, the monarchy's approval ratings surged, not because of Charles, not because of William, but because of her. The people didn't just sympathize, they chose sides. And Catherine, without lifting a finger, became their queen in waiting. Even Anne's actions, once perceived as severe, were now recast in a new light. What was once viewed as a ruthless purge now looked like fierce protection. Anne wasn't acting from rage, she was shielding the monarchy's future. And Catherine was that future. Together, though so different in age, demeanor, and background, the two women had drawn a line through the palace. On one side, chaos. On the other, composure. It wasn't just loyalty, it was strategy. A generational handoff playing out in silence, one unspoken move at a time. But in the shadow of this public victory, something stirs. Anne is watching the throne not for glory, but to ensure it survives.